Well, welcome everybody to the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Geisner, and I'm really excited and actually thrilled to introduce two of my colleagues and friends, Bonnie and Esther, are second generation Holocaust survivors, just like I am. And we'll start with allowing both of them. I want to tell you that it's such a unique situation. They're identical twins. And we have my first identical twin podcast interview today. So let's start with one of you or both of you adding a little bit about, I know your father was a Holocaust survivor. So why don't we tell a little bit about his experiences before the war, what his family was like, and then what his camp experiences were like. So you can decide who will go first.
Do you want to start, Bonnie?
Okay. So our father was never in a concentration camp. He was everything else that could go wrong went wrong, but he was not actually in a concentration camp. But anyway, so he was born in 1910 in the province of Turka in Poland and the village of Jabłonka. This is southeast Poland, or Galicia, which is now part of the Ukraine. And
City of Lvov, actually.
Yeah,
the great.
It's about an hour south of Lvov.
Yeah.
Or like they call Lviv now. So what was the question?
Just tell a little bit about what his pre-war family was.
Oh, okay, pre-war, okay.
As a child.
So he went as a child. He went through. As a child, went through the First World War as well. He was very young, and there was a pogrom that he and his father and his mother managed to get away from. He did not. Then his father, at the start of World War I, was drafted into the Polish army to then, at that time, to fight the Russians, I believe.
I would like to add that they were a Hasidic family, by the way, very observant also.
Yeah. And his father was away for 4 years, so he did not come back until my father was 8. Meanwhile, for 2 years, he and his mother and grandparents had fled south. The Jews were forced to flee Galicia. They fled to Czechoslovakia for 2 years. And at that time, his two grandmothers died from starvation. And then they come back and they're reunited with the father. And then more siblings come along. When my father was 9, his sister was born, and then some other siblings. They had lost a baby sister early on when he was 4 years old.
And here's a picture, the only picture we have of him.
Yeah.
And the only picture we have of any of our ancestors. In other words, we have no pictures of our grandparents. This is him and his grandparents, not his parents.
His paternal grandparents.
Right. We have no other pictures, no pictures of his family, nothing.
Yeah. So anyway, so they are living, okay. His father had a business, had a farm and a store. They sold, a general store, I guess, and liquor store. And they were not poor, probably weren't rich, but they did okay for themselves, I think. They probably would have considered middle class, what we would call middle class. And he went to school and everything. And then he had these brothers and sisters. And then my father got married around 1932, I think, something like that. To actually a first cousin, but she was a step first cousin of his.
She was like adopted by cousins, so she wasn't his, but she was.
Yeah, his aunt had married someone who had a child, a widower who had a child, something like that. So anyway, he moves to her town, which is about 20 miles away, Matkov, and they lived there. And he was given a textile business to run by his father-in-law, and so they're just having a okay life there. He had 2 children born in 1935 and 1937, 2 girls. And in 1939, the Russians come. It was not the Germans who, even though the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, they did not come to the Galicia until 1941. The Russians were there first. And he went to work for the Russians, and it wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible.
They sort of took over his business, but he worked for them, even though it previously had been his business.
Right, because they had private businesses. Everything was like a co-op type of thing. And they're living, as best they can. And then 1941 is when all the trouble starts. And I don't know exactly the sequence of events, but at some point I don't know if Motkov became a ghetto or not. That I'm not sure about. But in any case, Jews started being taken away from the town to be killed by the Nazis. And a bunch of people decide to go to the forest to hide. This was actually quite common in all these little areas for people to flee to the forest. And maybe hundreds of people did that. I'm not sure how many. And they do that. And then after some time, my father and some other men go to look for food. And he comes back some hours later and everyone's gone. They can't find anybody. His wife, children, all the other people who fled. He goes back to his town and doesn't know what to think. After 2 weeks, someone comes back and told them what happened. That the Jews herded the Nazis herded all these Jews to somewhere in the forest. I don't know if they were previously dug ditches or they had to dig ditches, but in any case, they shot everybody who they were herded there. A few people escaped. That's why one man was able to come back and tell them what happened. So sometime after that, he ends up in a Sambor ghetto. Now, prior to his arrival,
at some point previous to that, he had once the Germans came in, he had to work for the Germans, some menial, right?
Yeah.
And at some point he was sent to a labor camp.
Yeah.
But really tricked somebody into letting him go. So I'm not sure he was ever actually at the labor camp.
I think he was there for maybe a week or something.
Oh, he wasn't there for a week.
No? Oh, okay.
I mean, I remember him saying, that he knew that he wouldn't last a week there if he ended up there.
Oh.
And I believe he tricked somebody by saying he had a suitcase of money for them or something like that if they let him go. I think it was, I'm not even sure he ever was actually there, but he did. But because he was conscripted for it, he got papers.
Yeah, he got a work permit. Yeah. So he goes to Sambor. He was taken to the Sambor ghetto. Meanwhile, the rest of his family was already at the Sambor ghetto for about a month or so prior to that. So his father, his brothers, his sister, one brother had already been conscripted into the army sometime before that. So he wasn't there. One of these
and never heard from
brothers. And they were never heard from again. He was never heard from again. So they come and he finds out, first of all, that his mother never made it into the ghetto. She was they had like an anteroom or something where they separated people, and she was taken away. They find out at some point that she was taken to Belzec. And that means that within a few hours, likely she had been killed, because Belzec was an extermination camp. And my uncle had written a book some time ago. It's called From Partisan to Prisoner of Partisan, my Holocaust story. A lot of stuff is in there about, this is my father's story too. My uncle's story is my father's story, basically. They were together in the ghetto. And this is a few months go by. By April, just around Pesach time, this well-known action took place. I've seen it documented in an article somewhere about the Germans rounding up people and jailing them in the Sambor ghetto. My father had a work permit, so he was exempt. And meanwhile, his brothers, his sister, his father were all in jail. Because he has the work permit, he was able to go to the Judenrat and ask if it's possible to get somebody out, get his family out of jail. So the guy from the Judenrat said, well, I can get one person. I can't get everybody. So I said, okay, do what you can. He goes, he's able to just call the name Gleicher. And my uncle, who is one of my father's youngest brothers, comes over to the front and he says, come with me. And he takes him out and he takes him to my father. Meanwhile, after that, everybody in the jail was lined up against the wall and shot, and that was the end of that. So my father and his brother, who was 12 and a half years younger than him, planned to escape the ghetto. And they and some other people were able to dig their way out somehow, and they escaped to the forest. And their adventures begin in the forest, and they were there for 20 years.
Right. They were there for 22 months.
Yeah, almost 2 years. various former neighbors helped them. Now, some people were good to them because they remembered that the father had the general store and that he sold them their liquor. These are mostly Ukrainians. Their village had been 90% Ukrainian and like 10% Polish. And so they liked that. They were, they were inclined to help them because they remembered that he had been good to them. He had hired Ukrainians to help run his farm. So they managed, with some food, some shelter. But after a couple of years already, it was getting very, very hard and they were starving already. And then they come upon the Russian partisan unit. And the Russian partisans take them in and they give them, they said, if you want to eat, you have to learn how to shoot, So they give them rifles, teach them how to shoot. And they engage with them in some various, actions against the Germans. Unfortunately, my uncle was shot fairly early on in the jaw. And he was out of commission pretty much after that from going on any raids or anything like that. And he was tended to, and he was, he had a lot of trouble from this wound and everything. And meanwhile, my father is, going along with the partisans and everything. And finally, towards the end of the war, he ends up being not shot, but it was some kind of explosion near his leg, a grenade or something, I guess shrapnel. And this happened twice to his leg. The first time they were able to help him and everything. The second time, they were not able to do a successful, to prevent gangrene. I think he started to develop gangrene, so they had to amputate. It was a Russian hospital or something. And they amputated his leg, so he became an amputee. After the war, they make their way to the Fehrenwald, the DP camp.
Bonnie, I'm sorry. I believe he was in Germany in the hospital. That's because he would say that the German doctors or nurses screwed things up, and that's why
okay. I thought he was in a Russian military hospital.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Please get on.
You're off camera,
Yeah.
Esther.
Oh, for goodness sake. Okay.
So he's in various. Then meanwhile, my uncle is looking for him. He has to go through all these, hospitals, whatever, to find him, and finally is able to find him, and they're reunited, and they're in the Fehrenwald, and they meet up with people they had known. And my father mostly is recuperating. My uncle was much, much younger. He was interested in joining different activities. They had all kinds of activities. This is the biggest DP camp after the war. There were about 5,000 people in Fehrenwald.
What was the name of it again? I'm sorry.
Fehrenwald.
Okay, where was it?
This was
Munich,
in Munich. Near Munich?
Yeah.
And
Wolfratshausen.
It's called Wolfratshausen, something like that.
And how long was he in the DP camp?
They were there for about
maybe 4 years.
4 years, something like that.
Okay, so let's take a pause here and say, all right, so how did he where was his next stop after the DP camp?
So they eventually make their way to the United States.
From where? From
the DP camp.
Yeah.
They take a boat. They call the USS General Hahn boat.
Any stories that your father told you about the trip?
No, we didn't find anything. Originally, my uncle wanted to go to Israel, and he actually was in a youth Aliyah movement there, or group, but he didn't want to go without my father. And this particular, I guess, group, it was for young people, it wasn't for people over a certain age. And so my father was too old to qualify to go with them. And he told my uncle, don't go without me. So my uncle told him, thanks, but no thanks. I want to stay with my brother.
And this was, what year was this roughly?
1949. So they come March 1949 to New York, not through Ellis Island. I always assumed it was Ellis Island. It wasn't Ellis Island. It was just like Pier 52, like mid-Manhattan, the mid-50s of Manhattan. And they had relatives in the States. They had, his father had a brother who came in 1907. He had a sister who had married in Europe, and her husband came to the United States in I think the 1920s or something like that. And so they had a few relatives who helped them, and other people helped them. And they.
So where did they live?
My father was still recuperating.
Where'd they live in New York?
I don't really know.
Well, so at some point, I know that they lived on the Lower East Side.
Yeah, on the Lower East
They
Side.
also, I believe, lived in Washington Heights.
Yeah.
So when, where, I'm not sure.
But, you know, to the time.
We'll take a pause about your father. Tell me, I know your mother was not a Holocaust survivor.
Right.
She was born in the United States. So let's take a few minutes about what do you know about your mother growing up?
So her parents came to the U.S. around the beginning of the turn, near the turn of the century. They were kids, her parents, when they came, and married when they were fairly young. And her mother was somewhat observant, but her father wasn't. So I guess the family was observant to a degree. But unfortunately, when my mother was the oldest of four, and the mother died from an infection when my mother was about 23. So her mother
she had actually had a gallbladder operation. Our grandmother.
Now, your
And
mother
this
is
was
also in New York?
Yeah. So my mother's parents and her grandparents all lived like together. Her grandparents were Orthodox, and anyway,
How did
her mother.
How did your father and your mother meet?
I honestly don't know.
Yeah, no, I know because as my mother's sister, my aunt,
that's right.
was
Yes.
married to also a survivor, and he somehow knew my father because a lot of these survivors in New York, knew each other or something, or met up, and he was from the same general area also, and he probably suggested my father to his single sister-in-law, being my mother,
Yeah, actually, it was a friend of our uncle's who knew my mother's brother-in-law.
And what's difference in age were they?
My 8 years. My
father was 8 years older than my mother.
So by the time they met, my father was 44 and my mother was 36.
36.
And they needed a dance, or do you know?
We don't really know. They went on a few dates, I guess.
No, I think they just were introduced. I don't know.
They were introduced. I think it was a friend of our uncle. His name was Leon, who knew our uncle Larry, and so he said, I have someone who might be a nice, I know someone whose sister-in-law is a nice woman who's not. She's a little older. She's not married yet. So maybe your brother would like to meet. My uncle. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, my mother was still single because she, I believe, had a boyfriend who
during World War II
killed in the war, like a soldier boyfriend who probably was killed, and she had various issues. She had suffered from clinical depression at some point, was hospitalized, and a younger brother died. So she had a lot of trauma in her life. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, younger brother, 21-year-old brother had died a few years after her mother. Also, her grandmother died the same year. She had a lot of loss in a short period of time.
So, what was your father doing at the time once he came over to the United States? Did he start?
Well, he was able to get a job in a tie factory. My uncle had gotten married in 1952, and my father, for a short time, lived with my uncle and his wife. But then, they said you really need your own apartment, So in the same building, he got an apartment literally next door
in the Bronx.
This is in the Bronx.
They moved to the Bronx.
My uncle had a dry cleaning business. He got himself a dry cleaning business in the Bronx. And they wanted my father to get married. He was alone. He was, depressed. He never really got over the loss of his wife and children. So they to me and my mother, and she was nice lady. So they got married, and he told her, you have to be religious if you want to be married to me, because he never stopped being religious. Maybe he stopped being religious for a short time after the war, but basically he wanted her to become Orthodox. I said, okay, fine. And they did that. And
you both grew up in an Orthodox home.
Yeah. My uncle and aunt were not so religious. They were like half and half.
So when were you born?
So we were born in 1958. My mother had.
You're the same age as I am. When?
Yeah, I know that.
February.
What month? February. I'm July. Okay, so.
And also they previously lost a baby. A
Yeah.
baby boy was born 2 years before us, died, I guess, soon after birth. So can you imagine after going through all that and losing children and that they finally have a baby and it dies? I just can't imagine.
Can't imagine. And and my father never really wanted more kids. He agreed because my mother hadn't had kids and she really wanted to be a mother. And so he agreed. But he told me not many years before he passed away that he never really wanted more kids. And I'm thinking, well, gee, thanks. Anyway,
let me ask you how your childhood was. Who was first?
Me.
You're first.
2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes.
So tell me some memories. I'm always talking about memories of my mom.
Let's try to be a little succinct, just to, give a general short thing. Our childhood was filled with my parents bickering. So my father had a lot of anger. He had explosive anger. He was never physically abusive to us or my mother, but he was emotionally abusive. And
emotionally unavailable.
Cold to us, kissed us a few times a year.
Never really hugged or kissed her. I majored in psychology, so I've kind of analyzed it.
Right.
What about your mother?
And my mother was the opposite. She was very, very affectionate.
Very affectionate, very warm. She came from a very warm and loving family. We knew her family, her aunts, uncles, sister, one brother. They're all wonderful people, warm, loving people. So obviously now I realize that my father suffered from depression his whole life, and part of depression is hostility. That can be a symptom. So
and PTSD, of course,
and PTSD for sure.
A nightmare.
So he kind of generally ignored us for the first part of our childhood, more or less.
Although, well, I'm not sure I would say ignore.
But I mean, in some ways.
What did you guys enjoy doing? Were you creative? Did you do a dance, music, painting?
So it was art.
Esther's very talented in art.
For instance,
we took piano lessons.
Drawing, I don't know, see it, but okay, it's not that important.
Yeah, I see.
A drawing I did of that photo, actually.
Wow, terrific.
And she's very talented.
What were your careers as you got older? What were each of your careers?
Well, I was a homemaker. I worked briefly. For a few years, I was volunteering in my children's school library. I also worked briefly in telemarketing.
So your spouses, tell me about how you met your spouse and then your children, and then we'll come to you next.
Okay, so me first. Yeah. Okay, so I was set up. My cousin married someone from Montreal, and apparently her mother-in-law and my mother-in-law were best friends, and they colluded to get me.
So how did you get to Montreal from New York?
Yeah.
Why did you get to Montreal?
Because my husband's from Montreal. One of his friends was the son of my mother-in-law's best friend, who was married to my cousin, and
they used to fly down from Montreal to have dates with girls from New York.
Now our father, just as an aside, for very briefly, he drove us absolutely crazy about getting married. From the time we were 18, he wanted us to get married. Oh my God, you wouldn't believe it. What drove us absolutely nuts, and even, cajoled us to go to a shadchan, a matchmaker. Oh boy, that was did not work out at all. The guys were, we were from, but we weren't extremely from. We were modern Orthodox, and these guys were way too religious for me. I had a bad experience with one of them. And just at that time, I got a phone call from my cousins. He would say that just to go out with this guy from Montreal. I said, okay. So we do that, and within a couple of months, he proposed, and I got married. And I'm thinking, okay, no more Grossinger singles weekends.
Yeah.
Okay, now it's your turn.
So then I was single for longer, which of course was bad news for me, because as crazy as my father drove the two of us, then it was focused on me. And he was just, aside from the marriage thing, he just was abusive. And I'm sorry, I have a lot of guilt even talking about him, since he can't defend himself, but really said horrible things to me.
Yeah, he did say things he should never have said. So.
I worked for a long time at MetLife Insurance Company in the art department.
Mhm.
It wasn't a high salary, but it was okay. I lived at home anyway. And if I would get a raise, he would say, big deal. When I graduated college, he said, big deal. It was like insane, you know? Anyway, I eventually met my husband at Grossinger, at the Homo at a Young Israel weekend. He's a rabbi, retired U.S. Army chaplain and prison chaplain. And we met and went out and got married. Also didn't take very long. By then I was 27. So anyway,
have children?
I have 5 children.
Wow.
And I still have one at home who's graduating from college.
Terrific.
And I have 3 children, and they're all married and have children. I have 9 grandchildren.
So
yeah,
obviously there was difficulty with your father over the Holocaust. What's your earliest memory of your father? Did your father obviously talk to you about the Holocaust?
Too much.
Yeah, he knew too much too young. Let's put it that way.
He told us about the children and his wife when we were 7 years old.
I seem to remember it even younger, but maybe I just didn't really remember how old it was. It seems like we always knew. We always knew. Yeah.
So one of the areas that I'm very interested in, because I personally have been affected by it, has about this Holocaust trauma. Mm-hmm. So can you remember if you were, obviously you seem just like me to be affected by the trauma of the Holocaust from my parents. Mm-hmm. What was the earliest recollection that you could tie back something?
What I call my Nazi dreams.
Oh yeah.
Why don't you describe
I've always had Nazi dreams, like as I call them. Dreaming that you're in the Holocaust, or you're being chased, that you're in a ghetto or about to be whatever.
About to be killed, right?
All kinds of.
How do you manage through those?
I don't know. We just went along. I don't know. But I didn't manage. I didn't unmanage. It wasn't a nightly occurrence or anything.
Do you still have those dreams?
Much less so.
Much less for me too.
Yeah, much less.
But
so.
also we also read a lot.
Yeah, we read a lot.
Because I mean, personally, from a young age, I read books so that we had lots of information. So that fed into having the nightmares, because since we knew so much about what people went through. Yeah. Then that
in high school,
I
went through a period of just reading everything I could get my hands on. So I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I read Why 6 Million Died. I read every book out there practically. And so it was very well informed. And I realized that, boy, maybe, it wasn't in a concentration camp, but it was just about everything else that could traumatize them. So,
So how are you managing? You're both retired, right?
I don't know if they retired. I haven't worked, so I'm not really retired.
Whatever. That's not important.
Are you still?
Sorry.
Are you working still, or are you retired?
No, it's just that I do some art every now and then. So not that I wouldn't say I'm working, but I do keep up doing some artwork. So.
I also want to
tell. I can actually see the art behind you, and it's very,
thanks.
very, very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have we're about to finish up.
Yeah.
But I want to go into a couple new areas and say, okay, so what's on your bucket lists? What have you yet to do? What want to do? Obviously, we just have gone through COVID. How did COVID relate? Did anything about the learning about the Holocaust, your parents, and COVID? That fell into this whole world?
I feel like, thank God, my parents didn't have to experience the COVID thing, because if they had to be stuck in the apartment together, they would have killed each other. Yeah. So,
did the COVID have it? For instance, I found that my story is very different than your story. My parents never spoke to my sister or I about the Holocaust at all, nor to my father's brother. They completely only looked forward. They only consider the future. So the question from my perspective is, why did I have Nazi nightmares?
Interesting.
So I'm so far, I mean, I've had the same nightmare, literally exactly the same nightmare since I was probably in my late teens. I was all the way back there. So I'm always fascinated with the subject of that. But what's on your bucket list? What do you want to do? You just come through COVID. We're not, I know we're double boosted and we're double vaccinated and
quadruple vaccinated.
We're not still rushing out to go on a cruise.
Yeah.
But so what do you want to do in the next 5 years?
No.
The grandchildren I have are in Israel. One of my sons is married and has 4 children. And so we have been to Israel even this past year. We've been in Israel. I just came back recently. My husband is there for the year learning.
Oh, wow.
After he retired, he wanted to go back and learn there. So he's there now. Other than that, another son got married, and I'm hoping to have more grandchildren in the States, so I don't have to go to Israel to see them. And
how many total children do you have?
I have 5.
Bonnie?
So, personally, I, other than, seeing grandchildren and stuff, I always hoped I would do some great artwork. I guess I never really achieved what I wanted to with that. But other than that, I don't know.
Well, you're still young. God, you still can achieve. And
I want to mention something.
How many grandchildren do you have?
I have 9 grandchildren.
You have 9. Wow.
Yeah, 3 children and 9 grandchildren. We just were together for the first time, all together in the same place, for Passover at my daughter's house in Cleveland, Ohio.
Nice.
That was very, very nice.
I have one son who's 32 and is no rush to get married. He's living with a girlfriend in New York. They've been doing it for 3 years. I'm only wishing that I
want to mention that even as a child, I always said that my mission in life, I had like a mission for myself, that I want to make sure that I have religious grandchildren, that it should be that our half sisters did not die in vain, so to speak, that we fulfilled the lives that they might have had, had they lived. And I felt if I accomplished that, that was enough for me. And Baruch Hashem, I feel like I've done that. And that makes me very happy to know, that. In college, one of the very early researchers in children of Holocaust survivors, Dr. Harvey Barocas, was my professor. I majored in psychology. I took several classes with him, and he actually mentioned that he was doing research if anyone was interested. At that time, I was extremely shy. I wanted to, and I didn't want to, and I didn't. And now I regret not having participated in that. That would have been interesting. That's like 1978 or so.
Oh, wow. All right. Any last words before we leave you?
I mean, again, for the purposes of what you're doing, I think there's a lot of emotional damage for children survivors. And it's not only affects us, I believe it's affected my children.
How so? How do you feel?
Because we were, I guess, emotionally abused, is really, to be honest. I had a lot of, anger, and I took it out on my kids sometimes.
Yeah, me too.
That's a problem. And it's not, I have been through therapy. It's not really exclusive to Holocaust survivor families. I mean, other survivors of other, things like Vietnamese or whoever, a lot of other people have been through trauma, and it's, it's similar things. My therapist pointed out, it's not exclusive to you, but it's common in lots of different cultures.
Also, we were never allowed to express anger when we lived at home, when before marriage. We just were not, I don't know how we got the message that we're not, but we just knew that we could not express anger. And like my father's anger was like, took over everything. And we just learned to always keep everything bottled up. And I think the problem was that once we had kids, for the first time, we were in control
Yeah.
of someone else. We had control. And I think that this anger just came out, like it was, I would just, especially when they were toddlers.
Have you talked to your children about this discussion we're having right now?
Yeah, a little bit. I have to one of my sons. One of my sons is very much like me, psychologically minded. He didn't major in psychology, but he's very, self-aware and very introspective and seems to have an actual understanding of the psychology of these kind of things. So I feel I can talk to him, and I've told him about this, and he finds it very interesting.
Well, I want to thank you, but I also want to let everyone know that we are doing a program called Into the Light in October 23rd of 2022, which we're going to be discussing. It'll be the second episode. I think, Bonnie, you may have attended the first one in September of 2021, but we're exploring intergenerational survivor trauma. And what you're talking about, there are many, many cases. What I always felt like I was alone, that these nightmares that I was having was crazy, that no one else would be having these nightmares. And only when I found other 2Gs I could speak with did I start to realize that I wasn't alone.
Went through that.
And quite frankly, it's one of the reasons I love to interview 2Gs, because we all have something in common, this emotional connection. However, whether it's my parents didn't speak, your parents spoke.
Yeah, my husband's parents didn't either. My mother-in-law was in Auschwitz, and my husband really knows almost nothing about his parents.
My mother was in Auschwitz too, and since COVID, I've been on a mission to try to learn my parents' Shoah past with research and and networking. So listen, I want to again thank you to be part of the Obligation of Memory podcast. You'll be one of the founding podcasts that will go live.
Thank you.